Good afternoon and welcome to a webinar on the economics of soil health systems on South Dakota farms. My name is Byron Rath and I serve as the Soil Health Institute's Sustainability Specialist. Soil Health Institute's a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to enhance and protect the vitality and productivity of soil through scientific research and advancement. Today's webinar is the sixth in a series of 9 state-based webinars on the economics of soil health systems. And this research aims to address the most frequent question that we receive from farmers, landowners, and their advisors, and that is, what are the economics of adopting soil health practices and systems? So to answer this question and address this knowledge gap, we interviewed 100 farmers across 9 states with the support of Cargill, and today we'll be sharing the results from the 10 farms that we assessed in South Dakota. In June, we'll be releasing an aggregated fact sheet of all 100 farms that were assessed. This project was not designed to be a random sample of all the farmers and their economics, but instead to intentionally interview the farmers who've been successfully implementing soil health systems for 5 or more years so that we can understand the economics of those systems as compared to their conventional counterparts. Tomorrow, you'll receive a recording of this webinar and the fact sheet for the 10 farms assessed in South Dakota, and that information can also be found at the Soil Health Institute's website at soilhealthinstitute.org/economics. During this presentation, please enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and upvote any questions that are of interest to you, and our speakers will address those questions in our last 15 minutes. So lastly, thank you to Cargill for their support of this work, and most importantly, sincere thanks to the 10 farmers in South Dakota who agreed to be interviewed as part of this research. Without Cargill's support and those farmers' participation, this research and these results wouldn't be possible. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ryan Ciroli, Global Row Crop Sustainability Director at Cargill, who will offer opening remarks and introduce Dr. John Shanahan and Dr. Archie Flanders of the Soil Health Institute.
Thanks, Byron, and thank you all for taking the time to join the webinar today. On behalf of Cargill, I do want to offer a sincere thank you as well to all of the growers who so willingly offered to share their insights and their experiences to bring the study to life. Without their openness, this work would not be possible. I'd also like to thank the Soil Health Institute for their leadership and their incredible knowledge to help us better understand the economic benefits of adopting soil health management systems. I really do believe that this work is a critical question that we need to better understand as we look to scale soil health management systems. As attendees, I would like to ask you to submit your questions for the panel using the Q&A feature, and that as registrants, you'll receive the fact sheet after the webinar concludes and a link to the webinar recording tomorrow on Friday. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Shanahan, who is an agronomist and manager of the Economic Assessment of Soil Health project for the Soil Health Institute. John's career in the agronomy field has spanned both public and private sector roles, including positions at Colorado State University, USDA's ARS, and more recently with Corteva Agriscience. He's focused much of his efforts on developing and promoting the adoption of more sustainable crop production practices, including soil health and nutrient management solutions. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Archie Flanders, who is an agricultural economist with the Soil Health Institute, and Dr. Flanders will join John for the Q&A to answer any questions. So with that, I'll hand it over to John. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan, for that introduction, and also a special thanks to Cargill for providing the critical support we needed to carry out this project. I also want to express, as Ryan has mentioned, is a sincere appreciation to all the farmers who participated in this project and shared their experiences with Archie and I. We believe this project can go a long ways towards providing more farmers with the information they need when deciding whether they want to adopt a soil health practice. So Archie and I are extremely excited to share the results of this project today with you, involving the economics of soil health systems in South Dakota. We've been hosting these webinars on a state-by-state basis because we recognize that farmers prefer local information when making management decisions. So again, a little bit of background about why we conducted this project. We've known for some time now that many of the soil health practices, such as no-till and cover cropping, provide numerous environmental benefits, including storing soil carbon, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving water quality, and a whole host of other benefits. And likewise, we've similarly known that these same practices can also help farmers reduce soil erosion, for example. They can build more drought resilience in their operations, and increase the availability of nutrients, suppress diseases, and again, a whole host of other benefits. However, when we talk to farmers, what they tell us is that there's a large information gap around the business case for adopting these soil health practice systems. So again, our objective was to provide these farmers with economic information that they need when deciding whether they want to adopt these soil health management practices. So our approach, a little bit about our approach is, as Byron mentioned earlier, we interviewed 10 growers in the state of South Dakota who had, again, adopted these soil health practices for a minimum of 5 years. And the logic behind this for criteria was that it was felt that, and oftentimes research bears this out, is that there's a certain amount of time needed to start to see these benefits accrue when having adopted things like no-till and cover cropping. So that was the reason and logic behind the criteria pre-selecting these farmers, if you will. And then we interviewed these farmers. It typically would take around an hour, up to 2 hours of time, visiting with the growers to acquire their production information. And we use that information then to calculate what are called partial budgets to compare benefits and costs before and after the adoption of soil health practices. And I'll just refer you to our SHI website where you can find more detail around our methodology. So the only differences that we were interested in visiting with the farmers during the interview process is what were the differences between management systems. For example, a difference between their conventional system and a soil health practice, to say an adoption of no-till. We would ask what practices, what tillage operations were eliminated, and a whole host of other questions around these differences. So, and then recognizing that market prices vary over time, we calculated differences in revenue by using a standardized set of long-term average crop prices. And again, you can find more detail around that information in our fact sheet. We did not include the USDA payments that some of these farmers mentioned they had received. We did not include those payments in our analysis because many of the growers mentioned to us that while they were very critical in helping them adopt these practices, help offset some of the upfront costs associated with things like no-till and cover cropping, by the time they had been 5 or 6 years into the journey of these practices, why they were no longer receiving these payments. And so we wanted to calculate the economic benefits associated without including these payments. So you can see on the left here, this is the location of the farmers that we interviewed in the state of South Dakota, and there's 10 farmers there, and they're located in the eastern portion of the state, traversing most of the climatic variation across from north to south in South Dakota. You'll see also I also want to call your attention to the average number of acres devoted to corn and soybean. And you can see that's relatively evenly distributed between corn and soybean. So clearly the growers were using the corn-soybean rotation system as a critical component of their soil health management system. It's also worth pointing out too that the growers had also introduced wheat into their crop rotation, was either spring or winter wheat into that rotation. Again, that's considered an important part of a soil health management system, is to diversify your crop rotation with a crop like wheat. Also, just want to quickly call your attention to the size of these, average size of these operations, around 1,700 acres. So what that tells me is that these practices such as no-till and cover cropping can be adopted on rather sizable acreages. Clearly, the size of these operations were considerably greater than the average U.S. farm size. So we also asked them the questions about what % of their acres have they devoted to practices such as no-till, reduced till, and cover cropping. So this first set of bars here shows you that blue bar is the average of the 10 farmers that we interviewed in South Dakota. So these growers had adopted no-till on 95% of their cropped acres. And that compares with the USDA statistics that were acquired recently of around 52% of the cropped acres in South Dakota are devoted to no-till. And if you look at the average on the US basis, it's around 37% of the acres. those growers who were not using no-till were likely using some other form of reduced till, such as strip till, for example. Oftentimes, growers mention that strip till was used to help them deal with the cool, wet soil conditions often experienced in the spring of the year, and allowing them to establish better corn stands. But just looking at these two tillage practices, you can see that these 10 growers were clearly ahead of their peers and colleagues in the state of South Dakota in terms of having adopted no-till practices. None of the growers that we talked to had been using any form of intensive tillage in South Dakota. So the next question we asked them is, what percent of your acres had you adopted cover cropping on? And you can see here is around 22% of the cropped acres in amongst these 10 farmers where they had been using cover cropping. And that, again, that compares very favorably with the adoption rate of no-till and cover crops in the state of South Dakota. So again, clearly these growers had set an example of being having adopted a large percentage of their acres associated with no-till and cover cropping. So the next table now is sort of the meat of our presentation, if you will. It's packed with a lot of information, so I really want to spend a little bit of time unpacking that information for you. And so first of all, I'll just mention to you that the left columns in the table represent the partial budget analysis for corn, the corn cash crop. And then on the right side, you'll see two columns associated with the partial budget analysis for the soybean crop. And then also what I'll just call your attention to is the reduced expenses or benefits associated with adopting a soil health practice such as no-till or cover cropping are coded in green. And then if there were additional costs associated with adopting a practice such as no-till or cover cropping, those are coded in red. And so if you look at the upper left corner of this table, I'm just going to try to call your attention to a few of these line items in the partial budget analysis, and hopefully you'll get a sense of how these benefits and costs are applied in the partial budget approach. So for example, you'll see here when we ask growers questions about their fertility practices and if they had reduced any sort of fertilizer expenses or amendment expenses such as nitrogen fertilizer, phosphorus or potassium or liming or whatnot, you can see here that on average these 10 farmers had reduced their fertilizer costs by around $22 an acre for corn and around $7 an acre for soybean. Likewise, if we go down another row in the table and look at the benefits and costs associated with adopting soil health practices for fuel and labor, you'll notice that there was a little bit less fuel consumed. The costs associated with fuel consumption were reduced, which is what you might expect if you're doing something like no-till compared to conventional tillage. You're likely going to see less fuel consumed. Also, there's going to be less hours labor associated with operating machinery under, say, a no-till situation. And you'll look across the table and look at the differences and benefits and costs associated with soybean and see a similar pattern there. So likewise, if you go down to another row in the table here and look at some of these benefits and costs, you'll notice that equipment ownership costs, for example, when averaged across these 10 growers again, you'll notice that the equipment ownership costs or benefits associated with adopting a soil health practice like no-till, for example, you can see that there's a reduction in ownership costs, both for the corn and soybean expenditures. So when we sum up, we subtract the total additional expenses, this figure here of $36, subtract that from the total expenses or the reduced expenses associated with benefits of adopting soil health practices. It's around a $20, almost a $30 difference in production costs associated with producing the cash crop of corn. And likewise, when we go across the table and look at the benefits and the reduced expenses and additional expenses for soybean, you'll see that there's this also a difference in those two different numbers. So the next questions, some of the other questions we asked the growers during our interview process were around additional revenue that they might have gained from the adoption of soil health practices. And so we asked them a question, for example, did you perceive or observe an increase in yield associated with things like the adoption of no-till and cover cropping? And none of the growers that we talked to indicated that they had observed a reduction in yield, both for corn and soybean. And for corn, for example, of those 10 growers, the average yield increase for those 10 growers was around 6.4 bushels per acre, or 4 bushels. And the additional yield that the growers mentioned to us for soybean was 3.7 bushels. So when you multiply the price received for those additional bushels, you'll see that the revenue change for corn was an increase of the revenue was around $27 an acre for corn, and it was around $37 an acre for soybean. So when you add up all those additional costs and benefits and subtract the two differences, so these two numbers here for corn of $90, almost $90, minus the $36 of additional expenses, you'll see that on average, again, the change in net farm income for these 10 growers was around $54 an acre. And likewise for soybean, when you apply the same calculations here, you'll notice that the change in net farm income was around $50 an acre. So the next slide shows you a distribution of the change in net farm income that these growers reported to us for corn. And so you'll notice here that not all growers reported the same level of increase in net farm income, but all of the growers that we talked to had reported a positive increase in net farm income. Some of them more substantial than others. Also, when we look at the cash crop of soybean, you'll notice again that all the growers that we talked to and had indicated based on our partial budget analysis that they had seen an increase in net farm income. Sometimes the values that are at the higher end of the table, the larger values here, for example, growers sometimes mention that they were able to plant non-GMO crops, and so they would get an increased revenue from the value associated with the non-GMO crop. Or oftentimes these higher values were associated with growers who had reported to us significant yield increases associated with the adoption of their soil health practices. So we also asked these same growers questions about what other benefits had they seen from adopting these practices. And of course, we've already mentioned that 70% of these growers indicated that they'd seen a yield increase in their operation from adopting soil health practices for either one of those cash crops. Also, these growers, 100% of these growers indicated that they had reduced their fertilizer costs and expenditures associated with adopting these practices. We asked them questions about, did these practices increase crop resilience? And again, many of those growers, all the growers there indicated that crop resilience was increased. In other words, under drought stress conditions, for example, things like no-till and cover cropping had allowed the crops to withstand drought stress better than, say, a conventional practice. We asked them questions about, did these practices allow you to have improved access to field conditions? And sometimes growers would say, yes, after I've had a cover crop in the field, for example, I'm able to get back in the field and conduct a field operation sooner than if I was using a conventional practice. We asked them some questions about improved loan and land and insurance terms, and you can see there the percentage of growers that indicated some benefit associated with that particular item. We asked them questions about improved water quality. Did you see any benefits associated with no-till and cover cropping? And 100% of those growers responded yes. And typically what that response involved was that they would indicate that after a significant rainfall event, the runoff coming from that field, say with a cover crop, was much cleaner, less sediment in the water, and things like that. We asked them, do you feel like these practices are gonna provide you with some protection and license to operate going forward into the future? And you can see all the growers indicated that they felt that was the case. We also asked these growers, do you feel like that these practices have increased your soil organic matter values in your operation? And 80% of those growers said yes. And if I remember correctly, for South Dakota, that average increase was around 1%. Associated with adopting soil health practice. So just kind of recapping our findings here, significant findings. Again, just want to mention and reiterate how significant the operation size of these growers were, around 1,700 acres, indicating again that these practices can be implemented on large scale operations. these growers had adopted no-till on 95% of their acres and cover cropping on about 22% of their acres. And even before any kind of yield increase might be expected, these growers indicated that these practices reduced their cost of producing corn by around $30 an acre for corn and around $15 an acre for soybean. And these same growers also indicated on average that their net farm income was increased by around $54 an acre for corn and $50 an acre for soybean. So if we look at the current adoption rate of no-till and cover crops in the state of South Dakota, one can use these results to suggest that more South Dakota farmers could experience an increase in net farm income by adopting some of these soil health practices. So I'm going to just close here now and just mention that, again, as Byron mentioned earlier, this fact sheet can be found at our website. There'll be a recording of this website as well. So if we piqued your interests and you're interested in more detail around this project, I'd encourage you to check out our website. So I'll end there, Byron, and I'll open it up for questions.
All right, thank you very much, John. Well, it looks like we had 2 questions that were answered live in the chat. So I would invite others, if you have any questions, please do type in the Q&A. Please do type those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Maybe I'll ask John, as attendees are thinking about maybe questions that they have, if you'd like to add anything. Looks like Archie had responded to Vincent's question about conducting further analysis for the entire 100-farm sample to address specific questions related to cover crops. Didn't know, John, if you wanted to expand on that or expand on Casey's question. Casey Wenslaff also asks, did you use the startup cost of buying the equipment and technology needed to get started with strip till or no-till and the needed guidance technology?
So the answer to that question, Byron, is yes. And so anytime a grower would mention to us so say, for example, they were using strip tillage for and converting from, say, conventional tillage to a soil health practice. So the cost of commercial operation of a strip till machine was used in our calculation of our partial budget analysis.
Okay, great.
We referred to a commercial application or commercial costs associated with those published costs associated with those various practices.
Another question that came up that Archie answered quickly, but just to ensure that everybody on the webinar has seen it and hear it, Jerry Stevens asked, did you ask about their plans for carbon sequestration or carbon credits? I know that wasn't included in this study, but do you have any additional comments to add on that?
Right.
John?
Yeah, so occasionally there would be a grower that would bring that up in the conversation, and but we didn't spend a lot of time around that topic. It took us a fair amount of time to acquire all this information. Oftentimes our interviews went up to about 2 hours. So yeah, we didn't diverge too far from acquiring this information.
Okay. Sashiko Graber, apologize if I misspoke or mispronounced your name. You mentioned the specific type of partial budget analysis used for this assessment. Are there other cost revenues that might be excluded from the assessment? And could you discuss the potential implications on net profitability?
So Archie, I'm going to let you respond to that question.
Archie, we're not able to hear you.
Okay.
There you are. Now you bet.
Okay.
Yep.
Our interview method and the data we collected everything that is entailed in partial budget analysis that includes the differences in conventional tillage and the soil health management system adopted.
Okay. Byron, I think you mentioned somebody had a question around cover crop costs and whatnot. So
yeah, Vincent.
Yeah, so it's probably important for us to point out here in this table, for example, in that first row, this additional expense of seed that partially reflects the costs associated with the planting of cover crops, for example. But keep in mind now that only 22% of these farmers are the cover crop seed had been planted on only 22% of the acres of these 10 farmers. And so that number there reflects the average across some farms that weren't using cover crops. So it's a little bit diluted. That number is a little bit lower than what you would associate with the planting a cover crop. And I should add that when we produce our final fact sheet, we'll be summarizing the average cost of a cover crop seed for these growers as we produce that final aggregated result.
Okay. Great. Leland Schoon asks, what might be suggested as more quantitative measurements for organic matter and water use efficiency? What might be a good farmer tool for measuring carbon? John, did you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, so there are some accepted soil health measurements of carbon. I mean, soil carbon is is a standard measure now is done in quite a few laboratory analysis procedures. Soil organic carbon.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers the question, and maybe Wayne might want to interject there if he has anything to add.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that briefly, Wayne, you see some other questions around maybe the future of carbon credits and questions around USDA or private sector approaches.
Okay, all right. Yeah, in terms of measuring carbon itself, yeah, by far the most widely accepted technique is something called dry combustion, where you take a small amount of the soil and you pulverize it and you combust it at a very high temperature, and you're actually measuring the CO2 that comes off of that as that measure of that carbon that was in that sample. So that's by far the most accurate way. There are a lot of labs that do something called loss on ignition, which is measuring the organic matter, not just the carbon. But while that's a very common technique, it's because it's pretty easy to do. It's also not all that accurate, particularly for measuring carbon, because it also can be influenced by like the mineralogy of the soil and how much water is basically trapped within the layer lattices of the minerals and things like that. So when you dry it down, you don't always get all the water molecules out of it. And so there are some real issues with some of those kind of standard techniques that are very, very common. But for really focusing in on carbon, that dry combustion technique that I described is by far the most accurate.
All right, great. Here's another question that I guess that Kent Cooley asks, John, was the average percentage increase in soil organic matter based on soil test results?
Yes, we asked all the growers their soil sampling procedures. So many of them, for example, indicated that they were using some form of a grid soil sampling approach, some sort of precision farming approaches. A lot of these growers were using some of those practices, and so not all of them had that information at their beckon and call, if you will. Mm-hmm. So the folks that we talked to, we didn't ask them to have that information available. So most of those folks had to kind of mention their increase based on their recollection of their information. But all of these growers were practicing very routine soil sampling approaches. So they were keeping track of their nutrient levels, and that's how they basically made their decision to reduce inputs and things like fertilizer applications based on soil testing methodology.
Okay, great. I see, Wayne, that you've like to answer this question live. So Sachiko Graber asks about, I guess, the farmer selection process as part of this study. So her full question, what's the risk of self-selection in the farms considered not for this study or considered for this study? I'm not sure fully understand the question, but for instance, she says for farms implementing soil health management systems that were not profitable and therefore not included, is your thought that these farms are not implementing the practices correctly, but otherwise could be profitable, or are there other factors that influence profitability that were not considered here? So could you speak to the economic outlook for soil health practices for the average farm? Wayne?
Yeah, and so this basically the question I think gets at kind of the experimental design of this. You know, Byron already mentioned this was not a random selection of all farmers in the state. to determine, what the economics was of all those farmers. It was much smaller sample size than that would be required for that type of answer for that particular question. But instead, we were asking for those farmers that have been using soil health management systems for at least 5 years, what are their economic experiences? And so we did not really self-select people, and they did not self-select themselves just based on the fact that they had been profitable. So we were not doing that. We did not bias results in that way. Instead, we found farmers that had been using these systems for at least 5 years and then interviewed them for their economic experiences. And so I think that it's a very good question, but we avoided that issue by the way that we did select the farmers.
Wayne, I'll just add to that. I mean, if you look at these two graphs showing the distribution of changing net farm income, there were differences amongst farms in terms of adopting these practices. Right. Sometimes that might have been associated with some of those farmers had been a little further down the road in their journey. And again, this is not a one-size-fits-all thing, because these practices, you notice the distribution of those farms were across the wide geographical area of the state of South Dakota. And so things work differently in different places. And I think that's where this is really going to work. Need to have that local advisor provide that input to the grower so that they are successful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, John. Okay, well, it looks like we have two other questions. Maybe these are questions for you, Wayne. They're kind of future forward looking questions. One is around carbon credits, whether, USDA programs or private sector programs, if you wanted to speak to that. And the other, we have a couple more. Kurt Lawton asks if there are any plans at SHI for expanding similar research to rangelands or grasslands.
Yeah. And first, in terms of the question about, it looks like it says, is USDA going to have a program, or is it going to be a private sector regarding carbon markets, I believe? Yeah. There's obviously already a number of organizations that are setting up carbon markets and basically helping account and develop carbon credits, different verification programs and things like that for farmers. And so those are already taking off. I think that it probably remains to be seen what USDA will do. I gather from reading the news, like everyone else reads, that they are looking at their options and are very much interested in that as an additional driver for rewarding farmers for their environmental benefits that can accrue from adopting these soil health systems. Of course, carbon storage is one of those, but also improved water quality is another, improved biodiversity is another. And so there are a number of these ecosystem service benefits, as they're usually called, that really do accrue from adopting these soil health systems. So that's one of the things that, we are quite excited about, is that not only are these systems really good for farmers, but they're good for the environment. And so our hope is that there will be some of these markets that are set up and that are very successful, so that farmers can have that additional, reward for that investment that they're having, that the rest of society benefits from. The next question on whether or not we're going to, expand this to rangeland and grassland, we would love to. We're a nonprofit, and so that what that means is that we're dependent upon our ability to raise funds to conduct this type of work. We realized this was, I think, a great start, interviewing 100 farmers in 9 states. Another project we have going on with NACD, National Association of Conservation Districts, that NRCS is supporting, is looking at an additional 25 farmers in some 20 states. But we know it's a big country, and there's a lot of crops and cropping systems. There's about 400 different crops in California, and so obviously not every state is that diverse. But the bottom line is that I think there's probably always going to be the need for more economics information because all biology is local, and then when you add that kind of kind of the social dimensions and the management dimensions on top of the different soils and cropping systems and climates, then there's a lot of need for more and more economics information. So I hope that helps.
Great. All right. Well, we just have a few questions left. See if we can get to these quickly, John. Then let everybody have some time back in their afternoon. Leaf Fixin asks, $198 per acre on soy. Is that consistent for the entire 5 years?
So that would, Archie, I'll let you go ahead and answer that one.
Yes, the way we collected the data, it would be for each year. So it would include any initial year and any subsequent year that the farmer was growing the soybeans. It was the average for a typical for a year.
The average for a year during time which that system was adopted, Wayne?
Right. So the interpretation is yes, and keep in mind this is an increase. So the interpretation is yes, that increase holds for every year that soybean is produced.
Archie is, I'm wondering if part of his question is perhaps a little confused regarding the 5 year. We wanted people to be doing it for at least 5 years before we interview them. And I think to that extent, we would not expect that same dollar amount probably for those first 5 years. If that's kind of what you're leaning towards, Leaf, if that's where the 5 years is coming from. We wanted to get farmers that had been adopting these systems for a considerable length of time, a minimum of 5 years, and most of them are much longer than that. Many are like 10 to 20 years that they've been doing no-till, for example, because we wanted to ensure that that they had reached a certain level, kind of equilibrium with their adoption of that practice and with their kind of their experience with using these soil health systems, and not still on that learning curve with adopting them. And so we wanted to see, for people that are in that state, if they've adopted these long term, what are their economic experiences? And so this doesn't really apply to that first 5 year period.
All right. And last question, John, and this is from Van and Nick Saliendra on the carbon credits. Please, don't believe we'll have time to address that today, but please do reach out to us at info@soilhealthinstitute.org if you do have any additional questions, and we'd love to answer those. Van asks, John, did you see any increase in profitability with adding a third crop to the soybean and corn rotation?
So the answer to that question is going to be a little difficult for us to come up with just from these 12 farmers that we interviewed, or 10 farmers that we interviewed here in South Dakota. But we will possibly look at that sort of a question when we aggregate all 100 farmers together, because there wasn't as many. Not all these farmers had introduced another crop into there, so it clearly has an effect. In terms of how to quantify it, though, I don't know that we can do that at this point in time. Archie, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, I don't have anything to add. We didn't really collect the data so we could get a direct answer to that. That's something that we will try to investigate, because it is an interesting question.
Yeah, Byron, real quick, I noticed that Leaf Fixin pointed out again that very high dollar amount for that 1 year was 195, 198 in soy, much higher than everything else, pointed out that it was an outlier. So it's more of a question to John and Archie. Was that the situation that you described to me, where there was someone that was using non-GMO seed and was being rewarded financially because of that? Is that, or I'll put it this way, what do you have a reason or an understanding for why that one is so much higher net income than the others? Do you recall that particular farmer?
I don't recall that particular farmer, but
okay.
Having worked with the entire sample, typically large amounts like that are large, due to large reported yield increases would be the most
Right.
common reason for that to be. And then if it's non-GMO, that would also add to it. In that case, it's primarily the reduction in seed expense. However, as we're putting together our analysis for the entire 100 farms, we are going to try to incorporate more details about what leads to higher net farm income than what we have in this static table.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Hopefully that helps, Leif. Thanks.
Right. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Thank you for attending today, the Economics of Soil Health Systems on 10 South Dakota Farms. Again, you'll receive a recording of this webinar and the fact sheets by email. Those will also be available at www.soilhealthinstitute.org/economics. If you have any additional questions, please do contact us at info@soilhealthinstitute.org. And lastly, to help us improve future webinars, there will be a survey that pops up in your web browser when you exit today's webinar. It takes about 2 minutes, and your responses are really valued at the Soil Health Institute. So thank you again. Hope you have a great afternoon, everybody.